What happens when betrayal comes not from a stranger, but from someone you trust the most? In the ruthless world of corporate power plays, Samantha Taylor built her dreams, only to see them stolen by the very person she thought was her ally. But this isn't just a story of loss. It's a story of resilience, redemption, and the fight to take back what's hers. Ready to uncover the twists, turns, and secrets behind her journey? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The sunlight streamed through the sleek glass walls of the Market Street office, bathing the room in a warm glow that belied the tension simmering beneath its surface. Samantha adjusted the lapel of her blazer, her thoughts racing as she rehearsed her presentation in her mind. This was her moment, a culmination of 2 years of relentless dedication to her vision. Outside, the vibrant hum of San Francisco pulsed through the air, but Samantha's focus was fixed firmly on the boardroom ahead. The title of today's agenda, Next Gen Innovation Unveiled, loomed large on the wall-sized screen. Samantha tapped her fingers lightly against her tablet, running through her key points one last time. Across the room, Brian sat with his signature charisma, his easy smile a beacon of confidence. That smile had once been her anchor during late nights and long battles to build the company from nothing. She couldn't help but think back to their early days, days when their partnership had felt unshakable. She remembered the late-night brainstorming sessions, Brian pacing the room with boundless energy while she scribbled equations and solutions on a whiteboard. His belief in her brilliance, his knack for presenting her ideas with flair had made them an unstoppable team. But now, something about him felt different. His movements were deliberate, his demeanor almost rehearsed. Samantha brushed off the unease, determined to focus on what mattered, her work. Brian's voice broke through the quiet murmur of the room. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his tone as polished as his cufflinks. He stepped confidently to the front, remote in hand. "Thank you all for being here today. We've got something game-changing to share." Samantha tilted her head, puzzled. This was her moment, wasn't it? She had stayed late every night for months perfecting the product. Her name was on every draft, her sweat in every line of code. Brian clicked the remote and the first slide appeared on the screen. The title blared in bold, Adaptive AI Solutions, A New Era. Her breath caught. That was her title, her project. The room erupted into applause as Brian began his presentation. "This revolutionary product has been in development for years, and I'm thrilled to announce that it's ready to take the market by storm." His voice was smooth, practiced, as he outlined every feature and application. Her features, her applications. Samantha sat frozen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Her chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. "He's using my work, my work." She glanced around, searching for someone, anyone who might notice the injustice. But all she saw were nodding heads and admiring smiles. When Brian finished, the investors stood, clapping enthusiastically. Samantha forced herself to join in, each clap a betrayal to her own integrity. As the room emptied, she marched up to him, her fury barely contained. "Brian," she hissed, thrusting a finger toward the slides he had just presented. "What the hell was that? That was my presentation, my project." Brian's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of annoyance passed through his eyes. "Our project, Samantha," he corrected smoothly. "And as co-founders, it's my responsibility to handle the strategic side. You're the technical genius, but let me take care of the big picture." His dismissive tone struck like a slap. "This wasn't teamwork, Brian. You stole my work." Her voice trembled, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. His expression darkened briefly before he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Don't be dramatic, Sam. This is for the good of the company. Let's not make it personal." Before she could respond, an assistant appeared, signaling Brian for another meeting. He walked away without another word, leaving Samantha standing alone in the empty boardroom. Her hands clenched into fists as the weight of his betrayal settled over her. Back in her office, Samantha paced, her thoughts spiraling. She pulled up her files, her heart sinking as she confirmed her worst fear. The patent for adaptive AI solutions had been filed, under Brian's name alone. How long had he been planning this, and why? Her eyes burned as she scrolled through emails and meeting notes, searching for answers. She remembered the way Brian had recently sidelined her in meetings, cutting off her suggestions with polished reassurances. Had he been consolidating power all along? A ping from her inbox jolted her out of her thoughts. The subject line read, "Urgent for your eyes only." She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she opened the message. Samantha, Brian has been consolidating power behind the scenes for months. His next move? Pushing you out completely. Be careful. This isn't the first time he's done this. The email ended abruptly with no signature or additional details. Samantha stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. Her instincts told her the warning was true, even if the details were murky. Brian, her partner, her husband, was scheming against her, and she had no idea how deep his betrayal went. She turned to the glass walls of her office, gazing at the cityscape beyond. San Francisco's skyline, usually so vibrant and full of promise, now felt cold and uninviting. The foundations of her life, her marriage, her career, were crumbling beneath her. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going down without a fight. Samantha's heels clicked sharply against the glass-tiled floor, the sound reverberating like gunfire in the otherwise silent corridor. Her chest heaved with barely contained fury, and the printed slides in her hand crumpled under her white-knuckled grip. The bright afternoon light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows now felt harsh, almost accusatory. She pushed open the heavy door to Brian's office without knocking. Brian looked up from his phone, his expression a mixture of annoyance and feigned surprise. Behind him, the city skyline glimmered, an ironic contrast to the storm brewing inside. "We need to talk," Samantha said, her voice taut with restrained anger. Brian leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled casually. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "You know exactly what's on my mind," she snapped, tossing the slides onto his desk. Her finger jabbed at the title. "You presented my work as your own. You registered the patent without even consulting me. That's not just unethical, it's theft." Brian studied her for a moment, then let out a short, dismissive laugh that made her blood boil. "Come on, Sam. It's not theft. It's business. We're a team, remember? Everything we do is for the good of the company." Samantha glared at him, her hands trembling. "Don't you dare patronize me. I built that product from scratch. You weren't even in the room when it was conceptualized." Brian's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a calculated calm. He stood, adjusting his cufflinks as if her words were little more than a minor inconvenience. "Look, I know you're upset, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. Investors don't care who did the heavy lifting. They care about results, and I'm the face they trust to deliver those results." Samantha's voice cracked under the weight of her frustration. "You mean the face you forced into the spotlight by erasing mine?" Brian walked around the desk, his tone taking on a condescending edge. "If you're suggesting I undermined you, I think you're being a little dramatic. Maybe it's time you take a step back and consider whether you're still fit to manage at this level." The word "fit" hit like a slap. Her eyes widened, the air seemingly sucked out of the room. "What are you talking about?" He leaned in closer, his voice low and almost rehearsed. "You're brilliant, Samantha, there's no denying that. But the company's grown. It's a different beast now. It needs leadership that's adaptable, strategic, stable." The final word hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Samantha felt her composure cracking. "Stable?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're really going to stand there and paint me as unstable?" Before Brian could answer, his assistant appeared in the doorway. "Brian, the board is ready for you." Samantha's stomach dropped. "What board meeting?" Brian gave her a tight smile. "You'll see," he said, adjusting his tie before walking out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence of his office. The conference room buzzed with quiet conversation as Samantha entered, her presence barely acknowledged by the seated board members. The mix of seasoned executives and sharp-eyed investors sat around the polished table, their expressions unreadable. At the head sat Brian, already in command of the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Brian began, his tone authoritative yet personable. "I've called this meeting because I believe we have some critical issues to address regarding the company's leadership." Samantha froze mid-step, her breath catching. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Brian turned to her, his expression a mask of faux concern. "Samantha's contributions to the company have been invaluable," he said smoothly. "However, recent financial inconsistencies and missed deadlines have raised questions about our operational stability." "That's not true," Samantha shot back, her voice echoing in the room. "You know those delays were because of supply chain issues I warned you about months ago." Brian held up a hand, silencing her with practiced ease. "Samantha, I'm not here to place blame. I'm here to protect the company." And after reviewing the data, he slid a stack of papers across the table. It's clear we need to take immediate action to restore investor confidence. Samantha grabbed the papers, her eyes scanning the forged numbers and misrepresented data. Her hands trembled as she realized the extent of Brian's manipulation. He wasn't just undermining her, he was actively destroying her reputation. "This is a setup," she said, her voice breaking. "He's manipulating the data to frame me." One by one, the board members avoided her gaze. Her eyes darted to Evelyn Chambers, an older, stern member who had always been a quiet supporter. "Evelyn," Samantha pleaded, "you know me. You've seen my work. You know this isn't true." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, then raised a hand to silence the room. "Samantha," she said carefully, "if these accusations are false, you'll have an opportunity to prove it. But for now, we have to act in the best interest of the company." Samantha's heart sank as the room voted. She searched their faces, desperate for an ally, but found only apathy or veiled discomfort. One by one, hands rose in favor of her suspension. Each vote felt like a dagger. When the final tally was announced, she felt the air leave her lungs. "Samantha Anderson, effective immediately, your access to company resources and accounts will be restricted pending further investigation," Evelyn announced with finality. The board members filed out, their whispers a painful reminder of her isolation. Brian lingered, his expression a mix of triumph and feigned pity. "This isn't over," Samantha said, her voice low but resolute. He tilted his head, his smirk returning. "I wouldn't expect it to be." As Samantha left the office that day, the San Francisco skyline stretched before her, cold and unfeeling. Her mind raced with possibilities, her fury and determination battling for dominance. The foundations of her career had been shattered, but she wasn't ready to let Brian win. Not yet. Samantha paced her modest apartment, the soft clink of her coffee cup against the counter, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Her thoughts swirled with a toxic mix of frustration and despair. The betrayal was deeper than she'd imagined, and with every passing minute, it felt as though the walls around her were closing in. Her career, her reputation, the company she'd built from the ground up, all of it was slipping through her fingers. The buzz of her phone on the counter startled her. She hesitated before answering, her throat tight. "Hello? Samantha?" The voice on the other end was sharp, yet warm, instantly familiar. "Emma?" Samantha's voice wavered, a mix of relief and surprise. "I saw what happened," Emma replied, her tone firm, carrying an undercurrent of concern. "Brian's moves aren't just unethical, they're criminal. You need help, and I'm stepping in." Samantha's grip on the phone tightened. She hadn't spoken to Emma Cooper in years. They'd been inseparable in college, two ambitious women blazing trails in their respective fields. While Samantha dove headfirst into the tech world, Emma had chosen the grittier path of legal advocacy, often taking on cases against powerful corporations. Life had pulled them in different directions, but hearing Emma's voice now felt like reconnecting with a lifeline. "I don't know," Samantha began hesitantly. You don't have to know," Emma interrupted gently. "Just let me come over. You shouldn't be facing this alone." Within hours, Emma was in Samantha's apartment, her presence a blend of familiar warmth and resolute professionalism. Her laptop hummed softly on the coffee table, surrounded by scattered files and legal pads filled with notes in Emma's neat handwriting. "You've been quiet," Emma said, glancing up from her screen. Samantha sank into the couch, her hands curled around the mug she hadn't taken a sip from. I don't know where to start. Brian and we built this company together. At least that's what I thought." Emma's expression softened. "You know, back in college I used to envy how fearless you were," she said, leaning back in her chair. "You had this unshakable confidence. I thought, there's no problem Samantha Clark can't solve." Samantha let out a bitter laugh. "Well, I guess even fearless people have their breaking points." Emma leaned forward, her voice dropping to a serious tone. "Brian is counting on you to feel like this. He wants you paralyzed, doubting yourself so you won't fight back. But I've seen this playbook before, Sam. He's not invincible." Emma pulled a file from her bag and slid it across the table. "There's something else you need to know. A few years ago, I represented a client who had a falling out with Brian during a major acquisition deal. He manipulated financial records to edge them out and left them bankrupt. He's got a pattern, Samantha." Samantha's breath hitched as she opened the file, scanning the details. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Emma's expression darkened. "I didn't think it was my place back then. And honestly, I didn't want to get involved. But now, this isn't just about your company. It's about stopping someone who thinks they're untouchable. Samantha closed the file, her hands trembling. If I expose him, every decision I've ever made at the company will be scrutinized. Every mistake, every oversight, they'll twist it all against me. Emma placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Everyone makes mistakes, Sam. What matters is what you do now. You have the truth on your side, and that's more powerful than anything Brian has. Later that evening, Samantha sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through old documents while Emma continued digging through financial records. The room was filled with the quiet hum of activity, broken only by the occasional comment from Emma. Suddenly, Emma's phone buzzed. She frowned as she read the email that had just come in. "What is it?" Samantha asked, leaning over. Emma turned the screen toward her. The subject line read, "You're being watched." The body of the email was brief but chilling. "Brian knows about your little alliance. He's keeping tabs. Be careful." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "He knows." Emma's jaw tightened. "It's a scare tactic. He's trying to rattle us. But if he knows we're digging, that means we're close to something big." Minutes later, Emma's laptop chimed with another notification. She opened it cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning the contents. "This is it," Emma murmured, motioning for Samantha to come closer. "Brian's been funneling company funds into offshore accounts. It's all here. Shell companies, fraudulent transactions." Samantha stared at the screen in disbelief. This is huge," she whispered. Emma nodded. "It is. But we'll need more than this. We need to verify these claims by accessing the company's internal systems. Otherwise, he'll spin it as a fabrication." The enormity of the task settled over them, the stakes clearer than ever. Samantha's palms grew clammy as she considered the risk. "If we're caught, this could destroy me." Emma leaned forward, her voice steady and unyielding. "This is a risk worth taking, Sam. Brian's betting you won't have the guts to fight back. The question is, are you ready to prove him wrong?" Samantha looked at the screen again, her resolve hardening. "If this is what it takes to expose him," she said, her voice firm, "then I'm in." Outside, the city lights twinkled against the night sky, their beauty a stark contrast to the battle raging within Samantha's mind. But as she prepared for what lay ahead, one thing became clear. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. Samantha sat on the edge of a creaky office chair in Emma's small but meticulously organized office. Her palms were slick with sweat, gripping the armrests as though they could anchor her in the swirling storm of fear and determination. Across the room, Tom hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The blue glow of the screen bathed his face, emphasizing the tension etched into his furrowed brow. Emma leaned casually against the doorframe, though her sharp eyes darted between her watch and the hallway outside. The tension in the room was suffocating, the kind that made every sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint clicks of Tom's keyboard, feel amplified. "We're in," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in Samantha's ears. His words were tinged with both triumph and unease. "But their security protocols are no joke. Brian's got top-tier experts monitoring everything." Samantha exhaled sharply, pacing the small room. "Can you bypass it?" she asked, her voice tight. Tom hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "I'll try, but I can't promise they won't notice. These firewalls, they're designed to catch exactly this kind of thing." The weight of his words settled over the group. They all knew what was at stake. A single misstep would not just tarnish Samantha's reputation further, it would bury her. Yet the thought of walking away, of letting Brian's corruption go unchecked, was unbearable. "Do it," Emma said firmly, breaking the silence. "We'll handle the fallout if it comes." Minutes stretched into hours as Tom navigated the labyrinth of firewalls, encryption, and layered security. Samantha stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes glued to the lines of code flashing across the screen. Each keystroke felt like a countdown to disaster. The room grew stiflingly warm as the tension mounted. Every so often, Tom muttered under his breath, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. "Come on," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Suddenly, his hands froze mid-typing. "What is it?" Samantha asked, her voice rising with anxiety. Tom leaned forward, his face inches from the screen. "I've found something. A file labeled Internal Audit Confidential." He clicked on it, and an audio file began to play. "These cuts are necessary," Brian's voice drawled smoothly. "The older employees are a drain on resources. Lay them off, spin it as restructuring, and our quarterly reports will look fantastic. The board will eat it up." Samantha felt the air leave her lungs. The room fell silent, the weight of Brian's words sinking in. He wasn't just ruthless, he was heartless. "This isn't just unethical," Emma said, her tone cold. "It's outright despicable. We need to get this out." Samantha nodded, but Tom raised a hand. "Wait," he said, urgency in his voice. "We need more. Dates, names, hard evidence that ties this to Brian directly. Without it, he'll spin this as nothing more than a recording taken out of context." As Tom continued to dig, an ominous beep echoed from his laptop. His eyes widened. "Alarm triggered," he muttered, his fingers flying over the keys. "What?" Samantha's voice cracked with panic. "They've detected us. We need to get out now." A shrill alarm blared through the speakers, sending a jolt through the room. Red warning messages flooded the screen. "Tom!" Emma barked. "I'm wiping everything I touched," he said frantically, his fingers a blur. "But they know someone was here. They're already tracking us." Minutes later, Emma's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, her expression hardening as she read the notification. Brian just released a statement. The three huddled around as Emma opened the live feed. Brian stood behind a sleek podium, his suit immaculate, his expression calm and confident. "Earlier today," he began, his voice steady, "Samantha Anderson attempted to hack into our secure systems. This reckless act is not only a clear violation of corporate policy, but a threat to every employee at Apex Dynamics. Let me assure you, we will pursue legal action to ensure that justice is served." Samantha's stomach dropped as his words settled over her like a heavy fog. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the table. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she saw her name trending on social media. Corporate sabotage, Samantha scandal. The headlines screamed betrayal, incompetence, and worse. "I can't believe this," she whispered, her hands trembling. "He's painting me as the villain." Emma placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We'll fight this, Sam. The truth is on our side." But Samantha wasn't sure. The weight of public opinion, the venom in the online comments, it was crushing. And the doubt in Emma's eyes, however fleeting, cut deeper than she cared to admit. Hours later, Samantha sat alone in her dimly lit living room. The once cozy space now felt cold, almost foreign. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, messages from friends, family, strangers, each one a dagger of judgment. She thought of her parents, who had always been so proud of her accomplishments. What would they think now? Could they still believe in her? A sharp knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She hesitated before opening it, her breath catching when she saw a man in a dark suit standing on her porch. "Samantha Anderson?" he asked, holding out an envelope. "Yes," she said cautiously. "You've been served." He handed her the envelope and left without another word. Samantha stared at the envelope, her fingers trembling as she tore it open. Inside was a formal notice of legal action. Brian wasn't bluffing. He was suing her for corporate espionage. Her knees buckled slightly as she sank onto the couch, clutching the papers in her hands. This wasn't just about her company or her reputation anymore. It was about survival. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across the scattered documents that covered Emma's desk. The air in the room felt heavy with unspoken tension, punctuated only by the faint clicking of Emma's laptop keys. Samantha sat nearby, her fingers intertwined tightly as though holding herself together. On the screen, Emma scrolled through a series of decrypted audio files that Richard Clark had cautiously handed over. Clark, who had always been a quiet observer in the boardroom, had now become Samantha's unlikely ally. Emma paused mid-scroll, her face tightening. "You need to hear this," she said, tilting the laptop towards Samantha and pressing play. The audio crackled for a moment before Brian's voice cut through, calm and chilling. "We need to get her out. Samantha's ideas are good, too good. She's the kind of figurehead investors cling to. But if we let her stay in control, we'll never get to steer this company where we want." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers, trembling slightly, gripped the edge of the desk as Brian's words pierced through the room. Another voice chimed in, and Samantha immediately recognized it as Kelly Stokes, one of the more senior board members. "What about optics? Samantha's the public face. We can't just shove her out without a reason." Brian's tone shifted, laced with sinister intent. "We don't have to shove her. We make it look like she's fumbling, maybe even a liability. A few financial missteps, and the rest will fall into place." The recording ended, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Samantha stared at the screen, her face pale, her chest heaving as she tried to process the betrayal. "They planned it, all of it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to Emma, her eyes glassy with a mix of disbelief and pain. "Kelly, I trusted her. She helped me draft the financial reports they used against me. Emma reached across the desk, placing a firm, grounding hand on Samantha's arm. This is our proof. Brian didn't just undermine you, he orchestrated your downfall, step by step. Now we can show the world who he really is. Samantha leaned back in her chair, pressing her palms against her temples. The betrayal wasn't just Brian's. It was the complicity of people she had confided in, relied on. The realization cut deeper than she could have anticipated. "Do we release this now?" Emma asked, her voice soft yet measured. Samantha hesitated, her thoughts spiraling. If we release it now, it could jeopardize everything in court. But if we wait... Her voice trailed off, her internal struggle written all over her face. Emma nodded knowingly. It's your call. But you need to remember, every second we wait, Brian is shaping the narrative. Later that night, Samantha stood in her bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her features looked foreign to her, shadows under her eyes, tension in every line of her face. She thought of the years she had spent building her company, of the late nights and early mornings, of the sacrifices. And now, to be reduced to this, a pariah, a target, because of one man's greed. A fire lit in her chest, pushing back the doubt that had taken hold. She wasn't going to let him win, not like this. The next morning, Samantha walked into a bright studio for a live interview. The lights were blinding as she adjusted the microphone pinned to her blouse. Across from her sat Ellen Jacobs, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for cutting through the noise. Joining us today is Samantha Harper, the former co-founder of Apex Dynamics. Ellen began with a practiced smile. Samantha, your name has been at the center of a heated corporate controversy. Tell us in your own words what happened. Samantha took a deep breath, steadying herself. For years, I poured everything into building Apex Dynamics. It wasn't just a business, it was a vision. But somewhere along the way, ambition and greed overshadowed that vision. Ellen leaned forward, her pen poised. You're referring to your former business partner, Brian? Yes, Samantha replied, her tone firm. Brian orchestrated a calculated plan to remove me from the company. He falsified records, manipulated board members, and attacked my reputation. But this isn't just about me. It's about exposing the lengths some people will go to for power. She pulled a USB drive from her bag, handing it to Ellen. This contains audio recordings and documents that prove the conspiracy against me. It's not just about clearing my name. It's about holding people accountable for their actions. Ellen's eyes widened slightly as she accepted the drive, her professional demeanor barely masking her surprise. These are serious allegations, Samantha. Are you prepared for the backlash this might bring? Samantha nodded. I am, because the truth matters and people deserve to know who they're putting their trust in. The interview aired that evening, sending shockwaves through the tech world. Social media lit up with support for Samantha, with hashtags like Justice for Samantha trending within hours. But the response wasn't all positive. Detractors, likely backed by Brian's PR machine, painted her as vengeful and desperate. Hours after the interview, Samantha sat in her living room, scrolling through the endless stream of reactions. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Brian isn't done. He's planning something bigger. Be ready. She barely had time to process the cryptic warning when the doorbell rang. Cautiously, she opened the door to find a man in a dark coat standing on her porch. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of the porch light. You're Samantha Harper, he stated, his voice calm but urgent. I am, she replied warily. He handed her a small black folder. You'll want to see this. Consider it a gift from someone who knows what you're up against. Before she could ask further, he turned and disappeared into the night. Samantha stared at the folder in her hands, her pulse quickening. She stepped back inside, locking the door behind her, and opened it on the kitchen counter. Inside was a photograph of Brian shaking hands with a well-known figure in the tech industry, a man infamous for dubious dealings and corporate sabotage. Beneath the photo was a scrawled note. This is bigger than you think. Samantha's grip tightened around the folder, her mind racing. Whatever Brian had planned, it was clear he wasn't acting alone, and the fight was far from over. The heavy wooden door to Samantha's modest home office creaked open, revealing Richard Clark. His gray suit, perfectly pressed, hung heavily on his slumped shoulders. Deep lines etched into his face spoke of sleepless nights and a burden of guilt. Samantha looked up from her cluttered desk, her fingers still clutching a pen mid-sentence. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. "Richard," she said, her voice low, tinged with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Richard hesitated, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I've made mistakes, Samantha," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "and I'm here to try and set them right." Samantha leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing defensively. "Mistakes?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "That's an understatement. You stood by Brian's side while he tore apart everything I worked for." Richard sighed, the weight of her words dragging his shoulders lower. "I won't deny it. Brian knew exactly how to manipulate me. He threatened my family, my reputation. And I let him." His voice broke slightly. "But every choice I made under his influence has haunted me. And if I don't do something now, I'll never be able to live with myself." Samantha studied him, her expression unreadable. Trusting him felt like holding fire in her hands, dangerous and foolish. But in Richard's eyes, she saw something she hadn't before, desperation and perhaps the faint glimmer of redemption. "What do you want from me, Richard?" she asked cautiously. "I want to help," he said, placing a small USB drive on her desk. "This has everything. Recordings of board meetings, emails, proof that Brian orchestrated your ousting. I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but maybe I can help you fight back." Her fingers brushed the USB drive, the weight of its significance palpable. "Why now?" she asked, her voice softer, almost weary. "Because I've seen what Brian is planning," Richard admitted. "And if he gets his way, this company, everything you've built, will be in ruins." For a long moment, Samantha said nothing. Her mind raced, torn between skepticism and the desperate need for allies. She could feel the walls of her own doubt closing in, but the thought of letting Brian win was unbearable. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "But if you're playing me again, Richard, I'll make sure you regret it." News of Richard's alliance with Samantha reached Brian within hours. In his sleek corner office, Brian paced like a caged predator. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the scowl etched into his face as he spoke into his phone. "Clark is a liability," his attorney said, his voice clipped. "We can discredit him easily. He's got skeletons in his closet, enough to bury him." Brian's scowl twisted into a cold smile. "Good," he hissed. "Dig up everything. I want him to regret ever crossing me, and make sure Samantha knows exactly who she's dealing with." Moments later, Brian fired off an email to his PR team, crafting a carefully spun narrative. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his anger settling into a calculated resolve. "If they want a war," he muttered to himself, "I'll give them one." Meanwhile, in a quiet cafe tucked away from the bustling city streets, Samantha, Emma, and Richard sat around a small table. The tension between them was palpable as Richard slid the USB drive across to Emma. "This has everything," Richard said, his voice trembling. "Meeting transcripts, recordings, emails, it's all there." Emma plugged the drive into her laptop, her sharp eyes scanning the files. "This could be the breakthrough we need," she said, her voice laced with cautious optimism. "But we'll need more than this. We have to connect Brian's actions to the financial misconduct. That's where he's most vulnerable." Samantha nodded, her gaze flicking to Richard. "Richard, we'll need you to testify. Are you ready for that?" Richard hesitated, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. "I'll do what needs to be done," he said finally. "I owe you that much." As the team worked late into the night piecing together their case, Samantha's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Her stomach tightened as she answered. "Hello?" "Samantha," Brian's voice drawled, smooth yet menacing. "You've been busy." Her grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want, Brian?" "I thought I'd offer some advice," he said, his tone mockingly casual. "Walk away while you still can. Drop this little charade before it gets ugly." "Not a chance," Samantha shot back, her voice icy. "You're not scaring me." Brian chuckled, low and threatening. "Oh, Samantha," he said, "you think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But I know things that could destroy you." Her blood ran cold, but she forced herself to stay composed. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Brian replied, his voice dripping with menace. "Let's just say, by the time I'm done, you won't have a reputation left to save. Enjoy your night, Samantha." The line went dead. Samantha stared at her phone, her chest heaving with a mix of fear and fury. An hour later, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face darkening. "Samantha, you need to see this." On the laptop screen, a news article had just gone live, accompanied by a leaked document. The headline screamed, "Former CEO Samantha Harper accused of embezzlement. Internal files leaked." Samantha's stomach dropped as she scanned the article. The documents were fabricated, but they were damning enough to sway public opinion. "Brian's not just playing defense," Emma said grimly. "He's coming for blood." Samantha's jaw tightened as she stared at the screen. "Then we fight harder." As the clock ticked toward morning, Samantha's resolve solidified. The battle ahead would be brutal, but she wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. The courthouse buzzed with an energy only a high-profile case could generate. Reporters jostled for position outside, their microphones poised to capture any soundbite that would ignite headlines. Inside, the packed courtroom brimmed with tension. The air seemed to hum with anticipation as the judge entered, her gavel striking the wood with a sharp crack that called for silence. Samantha sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture exuding calm, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap betrayed her nerves. Emma sat beside her, flipping through a thick binder of evidence, her expression focused and unyielding. Across the room, Brian lounged in his chair, surrounded by a formidable legal team. He wore his usual smirk, exuding an air of unshakable confidence. His occasional glances at Samantha were smug, almost taunting. The proceedings began with Brian's lead attorney delivering a carefully rehearsed opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "this case isn't about justice. It's about revenge. My client, Brian Porter, has been falsely accused by a disgruntled former business partner who has failed to adapt to the realities of modern leadership." Samantha's jaw clenched as the attorney moved to the large screen at the front of the courtroom, presenting charts and selectively edited emails. "Here we see clear examples of mismanagement under Miss Anderson's tenure. Missed deadlines, financial inconsistencies, patterns of behavior that jeopardized the company's future." Emma leaned toward Samantha, her voice a sharp whisper. "It's all theater. Stay focused." Samantha nodded, her eyes fixed on the jury. But the unease in her chest tightened with every skeptical glance exchanged among the jurors. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she rose with calm determination, her measured voice filling the courtroom. "The defense would have you believe this case is about personal vendettas. It's not. This is about exposing the abuse of power and greed that destroyed the very foundations of trust in this company." She began calling witnesses, building a narrative piece by piece. When Richard's name was called, Samantha tensed. He walked to the stand slowly, his shoulders hunched. The room fell silent as he sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "What if I can't do this?" Richard had confided to Samantha that morning, his voice trembling. "You can," she had told him firmly. "You owe it to yourself to set things right, and you're not alone." Now, as he faced the court, his voice wavered. I was complicit in Brian's plans," he began hesitantly, his eyes darting toward Brian, who sat unflinching, his gaze cold and piercing. He manipulated us, made us believe Samantha was a liability." The defense attorney pounced, their questions sharp and relentless. "Mr. Clark, isn't it true that you've benefited financially from your association with Mr. Porter? Isn't it possible your testimony today is an attempt to cover your own wrongdoing?" Richard faltered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He looked toward Samantha, her steady gaze locking with his. In that moment, he straightened, his voice growing steadier. "I was afraid. I let myself be controlled. But what Brian did, what he planned to do, it's indefensible." Emma played the damning recording Richard had provided. Brian's voice, smooth and confident, filled the room. "We don't have to shove her out. We make it look like she's fumbling. A few financial missteps, and the rest will fall into place." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Samantha stole a glance at Brian. For the first time, his smirk faltered, his jaw tightening as whispers spread like wildfire among the crowd. The judge called for order, but the tide of sentiment in the room had shifted palpably. Emma seized the moment, presenting bank records that tied Brian to offshore accounts and lavish personal expenses disguised as corporate costs. "This is not leadership," she concluded, her voice ringing with authority. "This is greed, plain and simple." But Brian wasn't finished. His attorney stood, his face a mask of calm control. "Ladies and gentlemen, the plaintiff is no saint. Let's not forget her own missteps." He projected an old email from Samantha on the screen in which she admitted to a minor oversight years ago. Samantha's chest tightened as the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Emma leaned toward her. "They're grasping at straws, don't let it shake you." Then came Brian's final blow. His attorney revealed a grainy photograph of Samantha at a party, laughter frozen on her face, a drink in hand. The caption beneath it read, "Can she really be trusted?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The image was innocuous on its own, but the insinuation was clear. Samantha felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. Her heart pounded as she glanced at Emma, who squeezed her arm. "It's a cheap trick," Emma said softly, "but it's dangerous if we don't respond." During the recess that followed, Samantha and Emma huddled in a quiet corner of the courthouse. "What's the move here?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They're twisting everything, turning me into a villain." Emma's eyes narrowed in thought. "You take the stand. You confront it head on. Brian's whole strategy is to make you look defensive, like you're hiding something. You prove him wrong." Samantha swallowed hard, the weight of the decision bearing down on her. But as the courtroom reconvened, she stood, her resolve solidified. She wouldn't let Brian control the narrative any longer. As she approached the witness stand, she caught Brian's eye. His smirk had returned, but she could sense the cracks in his armor. The battle was far from over, and Samantha could feel the stakes rising with every step she took. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the air thick with tension as Samantha took her place at the witness stand. Her fingers gripped the edges tightly, and her heart pounded in her chest. The oversized photograph Brian had presented loomed behind her, a stark reminder of a night she wished she could erase. The image wasn't just a snapshot, it was a weapon, a moment of youthful indiscretion frozen in time. It had been a celebration, a hard-earned victory during the early days of the company. Samantha remembered the laughter, the clinking glasses, and Brian's easy reassurance. "Relax, Sam," he had said, nudging her to let loose. "This is your moment, too." She had trusted him then. That night, eager to prove she belonged in the competitive world of tech, she had let her guard down, sharing too much about an unannounced project. And now, years later, Brian was using that same moment against her. Taking a deep breath, Samantha began to speak. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of vulnerability. "That photo," she said, gesturing toward the screen, "was taken during a celebration. It was one of the first major victories for our company, a night that symbolized everything we'd worked so hard to achieve." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the jury, who listened intently. "I made a mistake that night. I drank too much. I let my excitement cloud my judgment, and I said things I shouldn't have. For that, I'm deeply regretful." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "But let me be clear. One mistake does not define who I am. It doesn't negate the years of sacrifice, dedication, and leadership I've poured into building this company. And it certainly doesn't justify the calculated, deceitful campaign Brian has orchestrated to tear me down." The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustling of papers. Samantha took the moment to glance at Brian. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he already knew how this would end. Brian's attorney rose, his expression predatory. "So by your own admission, Miss Anderson," he began, pacing the courtroom, "you jeopardized company secrets in a public setting. How can this court trust someone who has already proven careless with sensitive information?" The question stung, but Samantha didn't waver. "Yes," she replied firmly, "I made a mistake. But this case isn't about one night years ago. It's about a pattern of manipulation, deceit, and abuse of power. Brian's pattern. He's using this photo to distract from the truth." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but before Brian's attorney could strike again, the heavy doors swung open with a bang. A young man in his late 20s stepped inside, his face pale but resolute. He carried a USB drive in one hand and a stack of documents in the other. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My name is Nathan Carter. I used to work under Brian Porter, and I have evidence that I believe this court needs to see." Earlier that day, Nathan had paced outside the courthouse, the USB drive burning a hole in his pocket. He had replayed Brian's threats in his mind, the warnings that had silenced him for so long. "If you talk, you'll never work in this industry again," Brian had said. But as Nathan scrolled through the evidence on his laptop, the damning recordings and falsified documents, he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. "You can do this," he had told himself before stepping into the courthouse, his heart pounding with both fear and determination. The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy as Nathan handed the evidence to Samantha's attorney. After a short recess to verify its authenticity, the trial resumed. The USB contained a video recording of Brian in a closed-door meeting. His voice, cold and calculating, echoed through the courtroom. "Sign it," Brian ordered a terrified employee on the screen. "If you want to keep your job, you'll do as I say. No one will ever find out." Gasps filled the room. Even Brian's attorney seemed momentarily rattled as the weight of the evidence bore down on his client. For the first time, Brian's smug confidence cracked, his jaw tightening as whispers rippled through the audience. The judge banged her gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Samantha sat frozen, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her. This was the turning point she had prayed for, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. As the court recessed for the day, Brian brushed past Samantha in the hallway. He leaned in just close enough for her to hear, his voice dripping with venom. "You win this round," he hissed, "but don't think for a second that this is over." Samantha didn't flinch. She met his glare with a steely resolve. "We'll see about that," she replied, her voice calm and unwavering. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like a frenzy of vultures, microphones thrust toward Samantha and her team. She ignored their questions, her focus razor-sharp. Emma and Nathan stood beside her, their presence a reminder that she wasn't fighting alone. But as Brian slipped into the back seat of a sleek black car, his demeanor shifted. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed. "Make the call," he barked at his driver. Minutes later, he was seated in a dimly lit office, shaking hands with a shadowy figure whose face remained obscured by the darkness. "Do we have a deal?" Brian asked, his voice low. The figure nodded. "We'll take care of it." Brian leaned back, a sinister smile creeping across his face. Samantha might have won this round, but he wasn't done playing the game. The tides had turned, but the war was far from over. As Samantha gathered her team, she knew that the days ahead would test her resolve like never before. But one thing was certain, she wasn't backing down, so. The conference room buzzed with murmurs, the tension thick enough to feel suffocating. Samantha sat at the far end of the long table, her hands clasped tightly as she willed herself to remain composed. Across from her, Brian slouched in his chair, his once confident facade cracking. His eyes darted nervously toward the board members, their stern faces betraying no sympathy. The lead board member stood, clearing his throat. The murmurs ceased instantly. "After careful deliberation," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, "this board has unanimously decided to remove Brian Evans from his role as CEO of the company, effective immediately." The words echoed like a thunderclap. A flood of emotion surged through Samantha, relief, vindication, and a bittersweet twinge of loss. Brian's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for a response. Finally, he pushed himself to his feet, his voice rising in desperation. "Wait, you can't do this. This company wouldn't exist without me. Neither would its current state," one of the board members shot back sharply. "Your actions have jeopardized our reputation, our finances, everything. This is the result of your choices." Brian glared at the room, his fists clenched at his sides. But when he met Samantha's gaze, his confidence wavered. He grabbed his briefcase, muttering under his breath, and stormed toward the door. The heavy slam reverberated in the now silent room, leaving an air of finality in its wake. Later that evening, Samantha wandered the quiet halls of the office building, her footsteps echoing softly. The weight of the past weeks pressed down on her, and though she had won, the victory felt hollow. She had the power to press charges against Brian, to seek damages for all he had done. But as she stared out a large window overlooking the city, doubt crept in. She remembered the early days, the late nights spent brainstorming with Brian, and the laughter they had shared. He had been more than a partner. He had been her friend, her confidant. Could she reconcile the person she had trusted with the man who had betrayed her so completely? The thought twisted painfully in her chest. A quiet knock pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find Richard Clark standing hesitantly in the doorway. His shoulders slumped, and his face was etched with guilt and weariness. "Samantha," he began softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I owe you an apology." She folded her arms, her expression neutral. "For what, Richard? For staying silent while Brian tore everything apart? Or for enabling him in the first place?" Richard winced but didn't flinch. "For all of it," he admitted. "I let fear dictate my actions. Brian had leverage on me. Personal matters he threatened to expose. But none of that excuses what I did. I was weak when I should have stood strong, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Samantha studied him, searching his face for sincerity. "Words aren't enough, Richard," she said finally. "If you're truly sorry, you'll do more than apologize. This company needs rebuilding, and I can't do it alone." Richard straightened, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "You're right. I'll start by publicly addressing the staff, owning my mistakes and taking full responsibility for my part in this mess." He hesitated before adding, "And I'll waive any severance or remaining stock options. This company's survival is more important than my financial gain." For the first time in days, Samantha felt a glimmer of hope. "That's a start," she said, her tone softening, "but there's a long road ahead." The next day, Samantha sat in her temporary office, papers and legal documents spread across her desk. The board had reinstated her as CEO, but the weight of rebuilding the company felt almost insurmountable. As she sorted through Brian's files, a plain manila envelope caught her eye. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink smudged as though written in haste. Her breath hitched as she read the opening line. "To whom it may concern, if anything happens to me." The letter outlined Brian's descent into corruption. It described a shadowy investor who had coerced him, threatening to expose his secrets unless he delivered extraordinary financial returns. The investor, a figure known only as AG, had connections to powerful and dangerous players in the tech world. Samantha's hands trembled as she folded the letter. The revelation didn't excuse Brian's actions, but it painted a haunting picture of the pressures he had faced. More importantly, it hinted at a far more dangerous adversary looming on the horizon. AG wasn't just a threat to Brian. He could be a threat to the entire company. As the sun set, casting warm hues over the city, Samantha stood at the large window of her new office. The skyline glittered with lights, each one a reminder of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Despite the uncertainty, an undeniable sense of hope bloomed in her chest. A quiet knock broke the silence. Emma stepped inside, holding a cup of coffee. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. Samantha turned, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm okay, just thinking about what's next." Emma nodded knowingly. "Whatever it is, you'll handle it. You always do." Samantha looked back out the window, her reflection a symbol of resilience and determination. "Let's hope so," she murmured. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Somewhere in the shadows, AG was waiting, and Samantha was ready. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of Samantha's old office, casting warm golden hues over the stacks of papers and mementos scattered across her desk. She stood motionless in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the remnants of a chapter that now felt both distant and painfully close. Her fingers brushed across the edges of framed photos, notes from early brainstorming sessions, and the first blueprint of the company's flagship product. Each item was a reminder of the days when hope and ambition had fueled her and Brian's partnership. She picked up a photograph of herself and Brian shaking hands on the company's opening day. Their smiles were radiant, their eyes filled with determination. Samantha stared at the image, the ache in her chest bittersweet. "It wasn't all bad," she whispered, her voice tinged with melancholy. Carefully, she placed the photo into a small box labeled Keep. The weight of the past felt lighter as she sealed the box. But it doesn't define what's next. The courtroom verdict came swiftly and decisively. Brian was convicted on charges of financial fraud and corporate manipulation. His assets were frozen, his business ventures dissolved, and the name that once commanded respect in the tech world was now synonymous with scandal. Samantha watched the news coverage as he left the courthouse, shoulders slumped, his confident stride reduced to a shuffling retreat. In a dimly lit apartment, Brian sat alone, his jaw clenched as he stared at the walls. Regret hung heavily in the air, but pride, like a stubborn fortress, kept any apology from forming. For Samantha, this was closure, not victory. The battle she had fought was never about revenge, it was about truth. The company's restructuring began almost immediately. Samantha, alongside Richard and a revitalized board of directors, focused on steering the business toward sustainable growth and ethical practices. At the first all-staff meeting, Samantha stood at the podium in the expansive conference room. The room was packed, the air electric with anticipation. "This isn't just about bouncing back," Samantha began, her voice clear and steady. She paused, meeting the eyes of the employees who had stayed through the chaos. "It's about rebuilding trust, not just with the world, but with each other. It's about creating something that lasts, not just for profit, but for purpose." The room was silent, her words resonating deeply. Samantha took a breath and her tone softened as she continued. "I won't lie to you. These past months have tested me in ways I never imagined. There were moments when I doubted myself, moments when I thought about giving up, but every single time I remembered why we started this company. to make a difference. Her voice grew firmer. Leadership isn't about perfection. It's about resilience. It's about owning your mistakes and having the courage to grow from them. None of us are immune to failure, but what defines us is how we rise from it. Together, we'll not only rebuild this company, we'll redefine it. The room erupted into applause, and Samantha stepped back from the podium, her chest swelling with pride and hope. As the crowd dispersed, a familiar face approached her. "Miss Taylor," said Sarah, a longtime employee who had been hesitant to support her during the crisis. Her voice wavered with emotion. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up before. But seeing you fight for us," her voice cracked, "it's inspired me to do the same." Samantha placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's never too late to stand for what's right," she said warmly. Weeks later, Samantha found herself standing on a brightly lit stage at a packed leadership conference in New York. The room buzzed with energy as she stepped up to the microphone, her confidence radiating through the audience. "Leadership," she began, her voice calm yet commanding, "isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to ask the right questions. It's about resilience, about choosing growth over fear, and most importantly, it's about people." She paused, scanning the crowd. "There was a time not long ago when I questioned everything, my decisions, my values, even my ability to lead. But in those moments of doubt, I realized something important. Failure isn't the end, it's an opportunity. None of us are perfect, but what defines us is our willingness to face adversity head-on and come out stronger." Her tone softened as she concluded. "We are all a work in progress, and that's a beautiful thing." The audience erupted into applause, the sound swelling around her. Samantha stepped back, a faint smile playing on her lips. This moment was more than validation. It was proof that her journey, with all its scars and victories, had meaning. Back at her office, Samantha sank into her chair, exhaustion settling over her. The soft glow of her computer screen illuminated the room. An unread email blinked in her inbox, its subject line cryptic: "They're not finished." Her stomach tightened as she opened the message. The text was brief but chilling. "Brian wasn't acting alone. The puppet master is still out there, and they're coming for you." Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Samantha hesitated for a moment before answering. "Miss Taylor," a calm but unfamiliar voice said, "you'll want to see the package arriving at your office shortly. It contains interesting information about your next challenge." The line clicked dead before she could respond. Moments later, a courier arrived with a slim, unmarked envelope. Inside was a dossier bearing the initials AG and a photograph of a figure shaking hands with Brian. Samantha studied it carefully, her jaw tightening. "Let them try," she murmured, a faint smirk playing on her lips as she closed the dossier. The final scene unfolded in the bright, bustling space of the company's new office. Sunlight danced across polished surfaces as employees moved with purpose, their laughter and collaboration filling the air with life. Samantha strolled through the space, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she greeted familiar faces. Her steps slowed when she reached the centerpiece of the office, a wall adorned with framed photos of the company's journey. At the center was the picture of her and Brian on their first day, surrounded by milestones they had achieved together. Samantha stared at her younger self, the determination in her eyes mirrored in the present. For a moment, she felt the weight of everything she had endured, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of pride and purpose. Her reflection caught her eye in the nearby glass. She straightened her posture, her smile resolute. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, stepping forward into her new chapter. As Samantha's journey shows us, resilience and integrity are often our greatest assets in the face of adversity. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, there's an opportunity to rebuild, to rise, and to create something better, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. It's not about avoiding failure. It's about learning to embrace growth and courage through it. What challenges have you faced that tested your strength and values? How did you overcome them? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope, resilience, and triumph. Together, let's celebrate the strength that lies within all of us. See you in the next story.